Welcome everyone to the last speaker series of 2023. My name is Christoph Lüttke. I'm a professor of business ethics here at Technical University of Munich, and I'm also the director of the Institute for Ethics in AI. And with our speaker series, the Institute invites experts from all over the world to talk about ethics and governance of AI. These events serve as an important platform for sharing new research and exchanging knowledge. Since our launch in 2019, we have been able to hold 34 speaker series events with distinguished guests from all over the world. Today's topic is how technology unlocks frontiers and ethical dilemmas, the case of outer space. And we have the pleasure of having, not from outer space, but from California, from warm and sunny California, Patrick Lin with us. Patrick is the director of the Ethics and Emerging Sciences Group based at California Polytechnic, San Luis Obispo, where he's a philosophy professor. He also serves on the US National Space Council Users Advisory Group, a very distinguished group, and is affiliated with Stanford Law School, with the Czech Academy of Sciences, as I am, happy to say that, with the World Economic Forum, Aurelia Institute, and other leading organizations. Patrick is well published in technology ethics, including frontier development, especially outer space and the Arctic, AI, robotics, cybersecurity, bioengineering, nanotechnology, security technologies, and more. A lot of this we are also doing here at TUM, actually, from the technical side. And he's regularly invited to provide briefings on the subject to industry, media, and government. We will start with a presentation. Afterwards, we will have the opportunity to hear your questions and comments. We will try to answer as many questions as possible. So without further ado, Patrick, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christoph. Thank you also, Caitlin, for inviting me to give this talk. So today I'll be talking about, well, first of all, I assume everyone here understands that technology can create and give access to new spaces, new frontiers, right? Like cyberspace, for instance. And I assume everyone here understands that technology can also create new dilemmas, ethical dilemmas, such as AI ethics, which is on top of, many people's minds today. But what I want to do here is I want to look at the ethical impact of technology on outer space, because this is a case study. This is a domain, I think, that is growing increasingly in importance, very rapidly, and not many people are aware of this. Okay. I have way too many slides to go through in the next 40 minutes. But here's a quick look at what I hope to cover, at least roughly. I'll start with the basics of space law, because the gaps of space law is where we find the ethical problems. And then I want to focus on three categories of new ethical challenges for outer space. New problems in bioethics. There are old problems, but I want to focus on new ones. New problems in governance, and the possibility of armed conflicts and the dilemmas that are associated there. And if we have time, I'll gesture at some possible solutions to all this. Okay. So Christoph already gave me a nice introduction. I won't run through this, other than point out that this picture here was taken at the UN in Geneva when I was giving testimony on the ethics of killer robots at the invitation of the German ambassador at the time. So I have a nice connection to Germany already. Unlike, besides the usual academic stuff, we do a lot of public outreach and media work. We do a lot of work with government, especially security and defense, which is natural because oftentimes they're the ones building these technologies, and their use of these technologies have life and death implications. And I also work with industry and other organizations on other issues, including with Daimler and Benz Foundation on the issues of self-driving cars. I think I started with them around 2013, so we were one of the first research groups in that area. Okay, so enough of my biography. Let's just jump into it. Why are we focused on outer space as a frontier? Well, most of you, or many of you, might not realize it, but you benefit from outer space every day. Okay, and here are just only some of the ways. First way is what we call PNT, positioning, navigation, timing. So think about GPS satellites that could tell you where on this planet you are positioned, right? GPS helps us to navigate from point A to point B. Without that, I would be lost here in my trip to Europe and Munich, I can tell you that. Timing is so incredibly important in the digital world. Okay, like take for instance, financial transactions. Your bank is going to want to know exactly when you withdrew the money so you don't try to withdraw the same amount again 10 seconds later or 2 seconds later. Right? Timing is also important for computer to computer communications. Timing is important to mobile communications. Space assets and satellites enable new forms of communications, such as satellite phone, satellite internet, right? From outer space, we can observe the Earth in new ways, and it reveals new insights. So for instance, today I use it to check the weather, weather forecast, and I'm sure many of you, all of you, check the weather forecast. That involves space, right? Earth observation also helps us to do things such as look at the landscape to see how we could better manage the land. For instance, how we could better manage farms to improve crop yields. Earth observation can do a wide range of things, such as monitor natural disasters. We could see where a wildfire might be spreading, and we could help direct rescue efforts in where it's needed. We could also monitor, say, animal migration patterns, other environmental issues. We can monitor military troop movements, right? So it runs the gamut. So already you could see that space is a strategic domain for just about everything: science, industry, security, economics, and a whole lot more. That's why we're focused on space. But why are we focused on space right now? Because only in the last few years have we ramped up our activities in space. This is a chart that shows how many objects are being launched in space annually. And it's only since around 2013 or so that you see this hockey stick curve that it ramps really up. So there's a lot of things going up there. Things are happening in outer space now in the last few years that have not happened in the past, and this is raising new problems. Right? Space is more congested, and now it's also being more contested. And a lot of this space activity is driven by technology, such as artificial intelligence. Right? Just as AI is enabling new capabilities across the domains, AI is also helping with outer space. It's making our space vehicles more capable, more maneuverable. All right, so we have better control of space assets and can do more interesting things. Also, our rockets have simply gotten bigger. All right, and this is important because the bigger your rocket is, the more fuel it could carry. The more fuel can carry, the more thrust or lift it has. The more thrust or lift it has, the more payload, the more things you could carry into space. Potentially groups or colonies of people in the distant future. So if you compare, so right now on the right is SpaceX's Starship, which is a behemoth. Compare that to the first rocket, the V2 rocket developed in Germany some 80 years ago in the first days of rocketry in outer space, or the Russian or the Soviet rocket that launched Sputniks. These two look adorable compared to modern day, giants here. And for scale, if you're familiar at all with the Statue of Liberty in New York City, these things are huge. But bigger isn't necessarily better. We also have small satellites, sometimes called CubeSats or nanosats. And these are basically breadbox size satellites. There are thousands up in orbit right now. Some of them are interconnected. They form something of a mesh network, just like you might have a mesh Wi-Fi network here on Earth. And they could do things such as beam down internet signals and other communication signals. Again, AI and other technologies is part of all this. Here's an example of an enabling technology for our drive into outer space. Has anyone not seen this before? Anyone not familiar with this? Okay, so SpaceX has invented a reusable rocket booster, right? And, it's, as you can imagine, landing a falling booster to hit exactly the launch pad without crashing is no small feat. And they've crashed and burned many times. AI is part of this. And this is important for space travel because it's going to make it a lot more affordable. So for instance, I mean, how much does a plane ticket cost roughly from Munich to California these days? 800 one way. I'm flying back from Munich to San Francisco tomorrow, and the price is reasonable, more reasonable. But imagine how much the price of the ticket would be if you had to destroy the plane after you landed, right? You couldn't afford it. So that's the benefit of a reusable technology like this. The vision is the entire rocket and booster someday may be reusable. So it's not just a one-use thing. It used to be that states, nations were the ones that had satellites in outer space, right? Space was a playground for countries and nations. Now it's a playground for individuals. So most of the satellites around Earth are owned by private individuals or companies. More than half are owned by a single person, Elon Musk, and that is concerning to many people. Okay, so let me do a quick introduction to space law because it's in the gaps of space law where we could find the new ethical problems. And the reason why is that there's not a lot in space law. Basically, the main text is the Outer Space Treaty, ratified in 1967. And then we have some treaties about rescuing astronauts in trouble, how liability works in outer space, that you got to register your space objects when you launch them. That's about it. We have other declarations, agreements, and principles, but they're not legally binding. They haven't been ratified yet. So this is it. This is the main body of space law. So besides not being a lot there, they're very old, right? I mean, the latest one is basically 1976. These texts don't, and they can't anticipate modern problems like space debris, space cybersecurity. And cybersecurity wasn't even a thing in 1976, right? So there are a lot of open questions and gaps in space law. So for instance, I will be talking about space debris and space cybersecurity today. But let me quickly review some key provisions in space law and kind of foreshadow the problems that's involved here. So for instance, one of the first principles of outer space is that it should be used for peaceful purposes only. We don't want to screw it up, right? But what exactly does that mean? Does that mean no military is allowed? Well, we already have a lot of military up there. So people generally understand this as being, we can't have aggressive military actions in outer space, whatever that difference is. But what do we do with other technologies? I mean, just about any space technology is a dual use technology. It could be used beneficially or in an aggressive, military way. So take, for instance, a simple weather monitoring satellite. You could forecast the weather with it, but you could also plan military strategies and attacks according to weather patterns. So what do we do about that? Another key provision is that space law says we shall not have weapons of mass destructions in orbit. Doesn't mean we can't have it in outer space, just means you can't have a weapons of mass destruction, a nuclear missile that goes around the Earth in one full orbit. So if you could find a way to launch a nuke to the moon without going a full orbit, that's a potential loophole. Now, because space is thought of as this global commons, it's open to everybody to explore and to use. Space law says nations, states shall not appropriate anything in the cosmos. Can't claim the moon, can't claim anything on planets, can't claim asteroids and so on, right? But the problem is a lot of space activities today is driven by private industry. And space law doesn't say anything about private appropriation. It's silent on that. But states do own the things they send up. They own them forever, and they're liable for it. In fact, if one of the objects that a state launches comes crashing down on Earth, they are strictly liable for it. They're responsible for any damage on Earth, no matter whose fault it is. No questions asked. Another key principle in space law is that thou shalt not interfere with others. But what that means is unclear. Interference is never defined. And if you follow space affairs at all, it seems that interference goes on all the time, right? One satellite has to maneuver because another is on a collision course with it. That sounds like interference. Or GPS signals are being spoofed or jammed. That sounds like interference. Yet, no one's doing anything about it. As final example, even something as simple and as commonsensical and non-offensive as you must assist, in astronaut rescues, even that could be problematic, right? You can imagine someone weaponizing that to lure an enemy into a location in outer space, possibly, right? So there's a lot of room for interpretation, a lot of open questions and gaps in space law. Some of you might be familiar with the concept of customary international law. The idea here is that this is another way to make law instead of having everyone have a sit down at the United Nations and make international treaties, which is very, very, very hard, as I think everyone knows here, especially in Europe. And especially in outer space. It's hard to get consensus of the major spacefaring nations and the major world powers. So another way to make space law is to do this, to start a practice, right? A state practice that's become so widespread that it becomes a de facto norm. And once that happens, if that becomes a norm, then a couple other things need to happen, but it can then become legally binding customary international law if enough people do it, or enough states do it. And this is something, and the US is doing something like this with our Artemis Accords. Artemis Accords is supported by about 30, or maybe now more than 30 other nations. Germany signed on to Artemis Accords in September, right? So Artemis Accords sets out to establish some practices. That makes sense, I think. So for instance, it wants to set up a practice or, a process around resource use and sale, right? So how do we extract space resources? How do we use them? How do we transfer them? One of the most important space resources is probably ice, because ice can be converted into water, and you need water for long-term space missions. Humans need water. It doesn't make any sense to haul up all the water you're ever going to need for a long-term space mission. That's just way too heavy, and you're not going to get far in outer space. But if we can mine ice and convert to water on our way to another solar system, then that's how we can make these long space missions happen. Anyway, it seems silly to say that we should never use anything in outer space, even though it could save our lives, even if it could sustain these long missions, right? So there should be some norms around this, yet we can't wait for treaties to be implemented. That just takes too long. Another practice Artemis Accords wants to set is safety zones around research and work sites, right? This makes sense, right? Especially since we have many different nations, some of them fierce competitors, even adversaries. We want everyone to, be cautious and to minimize the risk of accidents. So we want there to be a safety cushion, a crumple zone, if you will, right? Around research sites, so the misunderstandings don't happen. Artemis Accords also wants to protect heritage sites. Think about UNESCO heritage sites. Same thing. Some sites, like the first landing of the moon, seem to be important in human history, and it seemed to be worth protecting. And the final example is Artemis Accords wants us to start thinking about the end of life of satellites. It used to be that you send a satellite up, and once it runs out of power, okay, it's a dead satellite. But no, we want those people to start thinking about how to deorbit their satellites, how to bring them back down to Earth and burn up in the atmosphere, or send them up to the graveyard orbit where they don't interfere with other satellites. Okay. I should note that space is still a state of nature of sorts. It's still a frontier. Even though we have some laws, we really lack law enforcement. There's no space police. there's no galactic United Nations to enforce any of this, right? So instead, we have to rely on diplomacy and self-interest for nations to cooperate. But for the philosophers and political scientists and others in the room, you might recognize that this is a challenge. It could lead to a prisoner's dilemma, tragedy of commons if there's no overarching authority. One difference between this state of nature and previous ones is that this state of nature in outer space is really fragile, as I'll explain in this talk. It's so fragile that we can only coerce other states and actors only so far, because if we push them too far, then that's bad for everyone. And again, I'll explain this in a bit. One possible driver for conflict is economics, right? Money is a root for many conflicts. It used to be that trade follows flag, meaning, take for instance, the ships from old world Europe sailing to the new world, right, under the flag of a nation. Once that happens, then commerce and industry follows, right? It used to be trade follows flag. Now it seems that flag follows trade, because space is driven by private industry. And the worry here is that this gold rush into outer space will lead to intense economic competition and potentially conflicts, meaning these companies will drag their nations into their conflicts. There have been comparisons to East India Trading Company and other historical examples of the bad things that could happen when there's this sort of resource rush without overarching ethical and legal principles. So let me give you an example. So take this asteroid 16 Psyche, right? This is an asteroid that orbits between Mars and Jupiter. It is huge. It's larger than the island of Cyprus. And it's so full of precious metals, things that we want. It's estimated to be worth $10 quintillion. That's 10 with 18 zeros behind it. I don't think any human can comprehend the scale of that number. In fact, that number is already larger than the entire world's economy, right? Which is only worth $105 trillion. So there's a lot of money at stake here. By the way, NASA launched a probe to this asteroid last month. It's not due to arrive until August 2029. So it's far away. Okay, so let me start talking about the areas of ethical concern. First one being bioethics. I mean, I'll point out the obvious that space is intrinsically dangerous. Space isn't exactly a natural environment for human beings. And as was pointed out in the early days of space flight, right, the editors of astronautic journals said, a good rule for rocket experimenters to follow is this: always assume it will explode. And we still need to assume that today, as we've seen in recent rocket tests. Take the Apollo 11, the first, landing on the moon, first landing of humans on the moon. President Nixon had a backup speech in case that failed. If you haven't read it, you should look it up. It's moving. I won't do PowerPoint karaoke and read this for you now, but we could go back to this in Q&A if you're interested. So always expect failure. But besides the risk of, blowing up or being stranded in outer space, there are other health risks that we now need to think about. So one is on a planetary scale. We need to be careful that we don't contaminate other planets or moons with Earth's microbes and bacteria, right? But also at the same time, if there are microbes and bacteria on other planets or moons, we also want to make sure we don't accidentally bring them back to Earth, because odds are we don't have any immune system to space viruses and space bugs, right? So this is called planetary protection. This has been going on for a while now, so not exactly new. But as we go into space more and reach into the farther corners of the cosmos, this is going to be an increasing problem. There's also risks to individuals, right? Especially children, right? So some of the physical risks to human individuals include microgravity, the effect of microgravity on a body. It seems to cause bone loss and other problems. Space radiation, we need to be worried about. We're not built for that. There's psychological risk of being confined in a small space, with a few other astronauts for potentially years. And if you're talking about kids, kids generally need to be socialized in order to develop, as a proper human being. But if they're isolated, or if they're stuck in a Martian colony with only a couple other kids, maybe no doctors, that is a big social and physical risk to children. So I think children raise a special problem for space travel, especially when you talk about long distance missions. You have to account for the human drive to have sex. If you're talking about Martian colonies, well, that implies that you need to have kids in order to extend the generations of the colonies. But there are a lot of bioethical questions there. So what we generally want to do now is to take that off the table, because we don't know how to have kids ethically in outer space. We have no idea how a human fetus will form in zero gravity. Okay. So we want to eliminate the pesky human sex drive as much as we can, or we should be trying to do this. A few years ago, one company called Inspiration Mars had a plan to recruit only older married couple as their astronauts in order to eliminate the possibility of reproduction. Right? I don't know. I mean, this seems to increase the odds of squabbling and more conflicts, but that's a different conversation. There are other plans to have forced sterilization of astronauts, or if there were a pregnancy in outer space, forced abortions. And you could see how these would naturally raise bioethics problems. There's also talk about having crews of a single gender, right? Either all male or all female, to remove the possibility of kids. By the way, a lot of these, they look like employment law disasters. They look like employment discriminations here on Earth, right? If you're recruiting only older married couple or only a certain gender. But maybe that's what we need to do in outer space. By the way, on the topic of single gender crews, there's growing interest in exploring the position that women are best suited to be astronauts, because women tend to be more collaborative as opposed to, commandeering and confrontational. Women, on average, have smaller frames and smaller bodies. That means they consume less oxygen, less water, less food. These are all precious, valuable, scarce resources on a trip. And the other benefits, like they give off less heat because of the less smaller body mass. One bioethical question is this. If we're talking about sending people to Mars, or setting up a colony, odds are, and Elon Musk and others have admitted this, odds are this is a suicide mission. This is a one-way trip to Mars, right? Now, some people would be happy to do it for the glory, but if you think about it, to send someone on the suicide mission, do we only just need their consent? Or, for those of us who work at a university, do we need something more, like an institutional review board or an ethics board to approve this? Because to some people, it seems to be a psychological condition if you have an overdeveloped sense of adventure, right? If your sense of adventure is so intense that you are willing to jump at a suicide mission, some people might call that pathology. So if that's the case, are we exploiting vulnerable people for these suicide missions? And even if these astronauts do consent to the risk, okay, what about their kids, their unborn kids? They don't consent. So what should we do about them? Again, children raise a profound set of ethical questions in outer space. So let me skip through this in the interest of time, but there are other bioethical scenarios we could talk about, including colonies. Okay, but let me move on to the second category, space governance. So I think the number one challenge to space governance now is what to do with space junk. All right, so space junk, space debris isn't just floating out there in outer space. It's moving at incredible rates, something like 12 kilometers a second. 12 kilometers a second. That means one piece of space junk can travel the entire length of Munich in about 1 second. Compare that to the speed of a bullet from an AK-47, which is only less than a kilometer a second, right? So anything crashing into space debris, no matter how small, it could be a pebble-sized space debris, that is going to lead to an incredibly energetic reaction. It could explode an entire spacecraft, right? So you do not want to hit any of these pieces in a minefield of a space debris. Right now, we're able to track about 55,000 objects in outer space. Most of it is junk, right? Only about 6,000 of those are working satellites. But the problem isn't just the 49,000 other things. There's more than 1 million bits of space junk that are between 1 to 10 centimeters long that we aren't able to track, right? And it gets worse than that. There's more than 128 million bits of space junk that are under a centimeter. So again, even if a satellite hits a space debris that's even less than a centimeter, that could potentially punch a hole right through it. So yeah, so space debris obviously is a risk to individual spacecrafts and human lives, but there's a greater risk. Some of you may be familiar with the Kessler syndrome. The Kessler syndrome is basically this inflection point when there's so much space junk out there that it causes a chain reaction of collision with other space junk that we can't predict and that's out of control. So if we can't predict it, we can't track where all those new bits of space debris will be going. That means we're enveloping the planet in a cocoon of space debris, and that no one is going to be able to safely leave the planet for hundreds or even thousands of years. So some astroscientists think that this is already happening, but we should definitely do what we can to prevent it from happening even more. Right? So we need to address the space junk problem. But the problem with removing space junk is twofold. Number one, there's a legal issue, right? How do we clean up space junk? How do we collect space junk and throw it back down the atmosphere to burn up if they're still owned by the states that launched them? Right? I'm pretty sure the United States is not going to want Russia or China touching our space debris, our dead satellites, our solar panels, things that might contain confidential information. Right? So it seems like you need the consent of nations before you could even touch the space debris. That's a big problem, and there's no good answer right now. But let's say we could solve this immense legal problem, which, by the way, few people are actually talking about because it's so giant. Even if we could solve this legal issue, there's still a technical issue. How are you supposed to catch a bit of space debris that's moving at 12 kilometers a second? And how do you even track? Even if you could clean up the 55,000 things that we're tracking, what about the other stuff, the other millions that we're not tracking? Now, technology again, AI again is involved in these solutions, right? So there are solutions that have robot claws that could pick up space track. But think about it, if you have a bit of space debris moving at 12 kilometers a second, the robot claw also has to be moving at the same speed, matching its speed and its velocity and its orbit and its inclination and all that. There are other schemes that involve shooting out nets to collect space debris, shooting lasers to push debris down into Earth so it burns up the atmosphere, tractor beams we're working on, right? And then other schemes. By the way, and we're a long ways away from any of these, and this is just ignoring the legal problem. But note also, these also have dual use potential. Right? If you could have a robot claw that could pick up space debris, then you have a robot claw that could do a rendezvous or proximity operation, RPO, on an adversarial satellite, right? So these are potential weapons as well. Okay, let me see. So in the interest of time, let me skip forward. If you're interested in the issue of space property, we could return to space property. Let me point out one thing here. So there is a real risk for conflict as it involves not so much space property, but research on planets and moons. So right now, both the U.S. and China are racing to the South Pole of the moon, right? Because there's ice there, and we could learn about the history of the moon there. But there's nothing in space law that prevents one of us from setting up camp right next to the other, even right on top of each other. That's an inherently dangerous situation, especially when you talk about adversarial states or competitor states. Artemis Accords, again, tries to mitigate this risk by setting up a safety zone around it. But to some people, setting up a safety zone smells like a property claim. But remember, in space law, nations are not supposed to appropriate anything, not supposed to claim property. I think that problem is solvable, but no one has really studied that very well, I think. Okay, so we can return to property if you like. It's complex. Property rights are generally thought of as a bundle of rights. It's not just one thing. Okay, so let me go to the next, the last category, which is armed conflicts. So, the possibility of armed conflicts is scary, and we like to say, well, all we got to do is take the military out of space, right? Don't do any more military activity. The problem is space is already heavily militarized since day one. Sputnik was a military project, right? So they ain't getting out of that. Military is already out there. But if we could contain that to non-aggressive maneuvers and operations, maybe that helps. There are new risks from emerging technologies in outer space, right? So think about the ethical and other challenges related to AI or biotechnology or laser energy weapons. Those would be imported into outer space as we use them, such as AI bias in identifying or classifying certain things. I mentioned already that there are many open questions in law that have implications for national security, such as what does peaceful purpose mean? What does interference mean? But I think the number one threat to space security right now and a possible factor in armed conflicts is, again, space debris. Because, estimates have shown that anti-satellite testing, right? So anti-satellite testing means testing, ways to kill a satellite. Oftentimes this is done with a direct kill vehicle or a state shoots a missile from Earth and hits a satellite up above. Satellite explodes. It causes more space debris. In fact, the estimate is that it causes 25% more space debris every time we blow up a satellite. The US has done this, Russia's done this, China's done this. But the United States is trying to lead an effort to stop anti-satellite testing. By the way, there are some anti-satellite measures that don't involve kinetic blowing up of satellites, like with cyber weapons. You might be able to brick a satellite. You could deactivate a satellite. We'll talk about that in a second. But so the reason space debris is a factor here is that if there is a kinetic conflict in outer space, if there's an open war or battle in outer space, that is going to result in incredible amounts of space debris, which means that everyone is going to lose. There are no winners. Even if you think you're a winner, it'll be a Pyrrhic victory, right? A Pyrrhic victory is a victory in which you lost so much, you might as well have just lost the war, right? So even if one state wins a space war, we would have lost so much that no one wins. So again, this points to the need for diplomacy instead of coercion and threats when it comes to outer space. It's such a fragile domain. This raises a brand new question that we haven't really had to face before, at least to the degree we have now, which is, do we have a greater responsibility to not create more space debris than our responsibility to protect, right? So we have a responsibility to protect, a right to self-defense. And if something happened on Earth, we might respond to it, with a military attack or retaliation. But if this happens in outer space, we actually need to think whether we just need to let it go. Because if we respond to it, it might escalate into a hot war, an actual situation that turns into space into this minefield of space debris that traps everyone on our planet. Let me do a quick time check. I think I'll skip these slides about interference. We could come back to this. The short answer is that interference is untested in space law. We're not sure what it means, and there's been no legal cases. But let me get a space cyber tax, because I think space cyber tax is going to be the main mode of conflict in outer space for 4 reasons. I mean, the first reason is that we want to avoid a kinetic war at all costs. So if there is armed conflict in outer space, it'll likely be a cyber conflict or electronic warfare conflict. 4 reasons. Number one, space is just so physically remote. You know, it's hard for us to attack anything in outer space. It's so physically remote, we can't even update hardware from satellites that have been orbiting since the 1970s and 80s. You can't update hardware in those satellites. You can't update their cybersecurity. So they make very attractive targets because they're old and vulnerable. And by the way, most of our connection to outer space is digital anyway, right? Through our smartphones and websites. So that's our main mode of connection to outer space. Number 2, space systems are incredibly complex. There's a long supply chain that's mixed. I mean, you have military vendors, you have commercial vendors, and all of them have different or can have different cybersecurity standards. So it's not clear how we can establish one clear cybersecurity standard across this complicated supply chain. Third reason why we might see more cyber attacks is that space law is silent on space cybersecurity and cyber attacks. Again, they weren't anticipated in the 1960s and 1970s. And again, you know, terms like interference are underspecified. So it's not clear whether a space cyber attack counts as interference or not. And the stakes are incredibly high in outer space, right? I mean, I mentioned in the beginning, there's a lot of critical systems up there: positioning, navigation, timing, GPS, Earth observation. There are a lot of attractive targets in outer space. If something, and that, and if there were a conflict up there, you know, we would feel a big impact on it because of these critical systems. Here's some lessons we might apply to space cybersecurity that we draw from Earth. Number one, space cyber attacks they're happening right now, and they're likely going to remain widespread because there's a lack of prosecution. Think about the big cyber attacks we had here on Earth, right? The major hacking of German systems or American systems. How many of them have been prosecuted? You know, we know who did it, but not a lot's been done. Number 2 is we can expect both military and civilian assets to be attacked, just like it is on Earth. Part of the problem is that it's hard for a cyber weapon to discriminate, right? They proliferate like worms and viruses, and they don't, you know, except for some exceptions, they don't really look for military signatures. We can't expect that there's a secret plan to deter all this, right? There's no secret cyber plan or some secret plan to shoot down a enemy satellite if they hack us, because secret deterrence is no deterrence at all, right? In order for something to be deterrent, it needs to be known. It needs to be known as a likely outcome. If you do something, then this other person will do this. If there's a secret plan, then that doesn't help. And the plan to combat space cybersecurity probably cannot be a kinetic plan. It probably can't be, oh, if you, cyber attack our satellites, we're going to shoot your satellite down. Because a kinetic attack just is not a credible threat, because it's already known it'll cause so much space debris, and it might escalate into a greater problem. And finally, even if you do brick a satellite through cyber means, right? We're not blowing it up. We're just deactivating it through a cyber attack. Even that can have a kinetic effect. First of all, a dead satellite is now another piece of space junk that needs to be avoided. If it hits something else, it'll turn into thousands or 1,000,000 pieces of more space junk. So even a cyber attack can have a kinetic effect. By the way, if you're interested in space cybersecurity, I'm the principal investigator on an NSF project on this. We're developing novel scenarios in space cybersecurity. Go to spacecybersecurity.org. I mean, the basic idea is we think policy planners need to have a wide range of scenarios in their minds when they make policy for space cybersecurity. But right now, all they're thinking is some vague scenario about hacking a satellite and something about spoofing or jamming signals, and that's about it. So we think there needs to be a much wider range of scenarios for them to consider. Okay, so let me wrap it up. We could go back to possible solutions in Q&A if there's interest, but let me wrap it up with one more slide, which is this. So space, outer space, seems to be a clean slate. I mean, there's some human activity, but we haven't really gone too far. We have plans to establish colonies in Mars and in the outer reaches. If this really is a clean slate, then this is our chance to start over again. We can do it right this time if we apply some forethought, we apply some ethical thinking, or in other words, let's look before we take that next giant leap for mankind. That is it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for this fascinating talk. Thank you very much for this fascinating talk, and we have time for questions. Please. Yes, Sven.
Well, thanks a lot. Very interesting. Now, I'm very curious about the possible solutions part of the talk, because I mean, you presented a lot of really difficult problems and dilemmas, and some of the ways that you set up some of the problems sort of suggested some sort of social contract theory solution. So anyway, if you could say something about
Sure, I'll run
solutions.
through this. And I mean, these solutions aren't great solutions. I mean, but I think there are small baby steps towards a solution. One is we should have more transparency and confidence building measures, being more open about what we're sending up and what we're doing with our so for instance, we know that China is sending up things in outer space and we have no idea what they are, right? And again, all this depends on diplomacy. And if we think of space as a state of nature, there's no overarching authority. So I think the best we have is still the United Nations. I know a lot of people, especially in America, are down or pessimistic about the United Nations, but in a state of nature where there's no overarching authority, the best we have is this loose collective, as imperfect as it is. That might be our best and only hope. Another thing to do is small cooperation, small baby steps in outer space. For instance, the International Space Station, I think, is one of the greatest examples of cooperation between adversarial nations. But unfortunately, the ISS is set to be deactivated, decommissioned around 2030 because Russia wants out. But in the ISS, there's no politics. I mean, there's politics on Earth, Russia, Ukraine, and America somehow involved in the mix. They don't really care about that in an International Space Station. They care about science. So if we could have more of those cooperations where we can, take politics off the table and increase trust, such as with cultural scientific exchanges. Some of you might remember this during the Cold War, where Gorbachev came over to Reykjavik and came over to America, and we had sit downs and got to understand the cultures better. That helps a lot. I mean, it sounds trivial and small and maybe a little silly, but just breaking bread with your neighbor, breaking bread with your competitor helps a lot. Well, in the US, we have a legal problem. We actually have a law that prohibits NASA from working with China. Another area is benefit sharing. There's only a handful of nations who are spacefaring. So it could, as an act of good faith or goodwill, we could potentially share benefits from outer space with other nations. Now, what that means could, it could mean different things. It could mean we could share the means to access space resources. We could give a country some space in our next rocket launch. Or it could be that we share the resources themselves. We bring nickel and iron down from an asteroid and we distribute that. Or it could be that we share the benefits from our knowledge and our activities in outer space to these other countries. So what benefit sharing means is not quite clear, but we might be able to work it out. Yeah, so those are my early, again, they're not knockdown solutions, but they're small steps that require diplomacy and goodwill.
Yeah, I'm just I'm wondering if since private companies have such a large stake in the space, can we or will they play a pivotal role in protecting that their commercial interests by coming up with solutions to, for example, cyber junk or
Well, you would think that there is, I mean, to some extent, there is self-interest, right? I mean, private companies do want to protect their own assets, and no one wants to have bad space cybersecurity. But the problem is that's a reality. Think about universities. Universities launch small satellites, like nanosats, into outer space. None of them have cybersecurity on board because it's too expensive for our schools to afford, and there's only so much room on a nanosat. You can't fit more components into it. But let me gesture at another problem with private corporations too, which is that they are driven by self-interest. They're driven by economics. That's not the same thing as being driven by goodwill and diplomacy and having humanity at the forefront of their mind. In fact, when you talk about space colonies, these are plans of private corporations mostly, right? NASA is not planning a Martian colony per se, but SpaceX is, all right? And if we know anything about colonies in human history, those rebel scum colonies all want their independence one way or another, all right? And if they're corporate, then they have even less loyalty to remain within a federation of Earth states or whatever we want to call it. Yeah, it's hard to chart a path forward when private industry is so much a factor in this, because they don't necessarily play by the same rules as states do.
question. You mentioned 6,000 satellites. You mentioned Elon Musk has more than half of those. Do we know, other than Starlink, what they're being used for?
Let's see. So let me go back to the one chart I think you're referring to. Oh. No, sorry. I don't know where my own slides are. Yeah, we do have some idea of what they're used for. So for instance, SpaceX here, mostly for Starlink. Jeff Bezos is catching up, right? Amazon has his Kuiper project. Here's UK satellites. They use it for satellite internet mostly. I mean, you got to assume the nation states have, some percentage of them are spy satellites, some are GPS satellites, and so on. Here are China's, US governments, but let's take Planet Labs, for instance. Planet Labs has almost 200 satellites up there. They're a San Francisco-based satellite company, and they do Earth observation, right? And that's about all they do, and remote sensing. And they're neutrals. They don't work for the U.S. government. They offer their services to many other nations for humanitarian purposes, managing farmlands and things like that. Russia, unclear what they're doing. Iridium communications, that's satellite internet. So a lot of this is communications infrastructure. Communications is so critical in the digital age. I mean, it's hard to overstate how important communications and connectivity is in the modern age. But that said, we have to assume that some percentage of these are secret projects or surveillance intelligence projects, or just outright military projects.
Then
Thank you. I had a question that is more going towards the diplomacy between the astronauts point in a way. So we're talking about the international station, but I know the DLR, so the German is working for the ESA, if I'm right, on mental health for astronauts. I know NASA was also mentioning to have some care robots at some point later in space with the astronauts to ensure that they don't kind of turn against each other as humans, which could create big issues outside or on Earth. Do you have any comments about that? Any ideas? We did look a little bit into the ethics of this, but is it still a point ongoing, etc.?
Yeah, I agree that this is work that needs to be done. And by the way, ESA, European Space Agency, is a leader, is very forward-thinking and very progressive in a lot of these issues. For instance, ESA has already recognized that disabled astronauts might be better equipped to be up there, right? Disabled astronauts are already used to being in confined spaces. They're already used to not using their legs. You know, legs don't mean anything in zero gravity. And they're used to hardships, and so you know they have a plan. I think it's called the Para Astronaut Project or something like that. But ESA is a leader in that, and thank God for them. They're leading a lot of this work, especially mental health work and other progressive work. NASA is doing some of that too, but a lot of it is just basic science and technology, and you know, getting up there. But I think we need more space agencies and private agencies and academic groups all thinking about these problems. They're multidimensional, right? It's not just a hardware technical problem, and it's not just ethical problems, but there's psychological dimensions, sociological dimensions. I remember not too long ago in the United States, we had a project called the 100-Year Starship Mission, which was a project is funded by DARPA and NASA, is trying to imagine what institutions do we need for a 5-generation trip in outer space? What does education look like? What does economics look like? Do we bring religion into outer space, right? And a lot of these other questions. So I think more of that thinking would be welcome.
Yes.
Hello, first of all, thank you for the presentation. It was amazing. It's funny that I'm going to ask this like exactly in this day because of the death of Henry Kissinger, right? And I see like the clash that it could create with states, but I'm seeing also like that graph is so evident that the leader in all this is not a state, but an individual, right? And so instead of grabbing a rational international relations theory to ask this, I'm going to ask a constructivist one. And I would like to ask you, and I know I'm going to put you on the spot here, but what do you think from Elon Musk as a leader? Because he's de facto leader of all this industry or movement or what's happening. So sorry for the question already.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me point out that yes, even though Elon Musk owns half these world satellites, space law requires states to be responsible for the launching parties. So if Elon Musk, SpaceX launches from the US, the government of the United States is responsible for SpaceX. So it's not like he has no oversight. Problem is, you know, he's also has, I think, Canadian nationality, South African. He could move SpaceX maybe somewhere else that's friendlier to his ambitions. But it's not like there's no checks and balances on individual actors. When it comes to Elon Musk, I mean, I don't know Elon Musk personally. I kind of work with SpaceX, you know, by virtue of being on the users advisory group for the National Space Council. My understanding is that SpaceX is not really run by Elon Musk. Thank God, right? But it's run by you know, more stable people. Yeah. But that said, I mean, you know, it's hard to deny that Elon Musk has delivered to the world things that otherwise wouldn't exist or as rapidly. I mean, he didn't invent electric cars, but he made that happen, right? He didn't invent this idea of reusable rocket boosters, but he made it happen. So for whatever, whatever vices and deficits he has as an individual, it's undeniable that he has a real imprint on science and technology in the world. Not all his projects work, but some do. And I think SpaceX is a great example of some of his projects that is working.
There's the question. Yeah.
How worried do we need to be about the security of cislunar space, and what ethical issues might entail there?
Maybe have just in connection with that. Maybe you can point to AI ethics examples or issues that we have, because it's maybe interesting.
Okay, so your question is, how worried should we be about cislunar space? So the space between Earth and the moon. And then you want me connected to AI ethics. I mean, it's growing in importance. And I think there's only so much worrying can do. I don't see much value in worrying if you're not able to do anything. But if your worrying can lead to action, can lead to influencing policymakers or designing new solutions, then yes, worry about that. But if you're not in a position to do that, then let's just cross our fingers and hope that cooler heads prevail. But let me give you, I'll give you an example to connect AI ethics with outer space ethics. And in fact, Christoph's group here has come out with a great paper I would recommend you to read, which is called Artificial Intelligence in Earth Observation. It has this great case study of how AI bias or AI classification can have a profound impact when we're talking about space systems. So think about satellite that's looking down on Earth, classifying neighborhoods, for the sake of development. Like here's some rich farmland, here's an urban center. Oh, this area, given its density and given its infrastructure, we'll call this area a slum. All right. Now, calling an area a slum is problematic because in some cases, yes, it could indeed be an actual slum, but a slum in different countries with different economic power can mean different things. It could be a normal neighborhood for another country. Yet if we label it as a slum, that could stigmatize it, it could divert resources away from it, or it could even mark it for eradication, right? So anyway, I would encourage you to check out this paper if you want more details of a real life AI ethics dilemma that's related to outer space. But back to your original question, I think, yeah, cislunar is going to be more crowded. And then we also need to start thinking about beyond the lunar system, beyond the moon. There's already talks about the lunar gateway. We have plans, develop a gateway that's around the moon that will take us past the moon. There's already talks about using Mars as a launching point to other missions, to asteroids and other planets, other solar systems. So, if you look at this chart, space activity is ramping up and up, and it seems to be there's no plateau in sight. So whatever problems I'm describing now are only going to be accelerated. So if if you have any interest in outer space, I would be very worried. If you don't care about outer space and you're happy to be stuck here and you don't care about GPS and things like that, then okay, maybe it doesn't concern you so much. But I think space is our future.
That's last question. Okay. Okay. But this was
Under pressure.
So I don't know if this question makes sense. Like it's a thought, and I still need to figure out how it fits together. But just expressing the thought. So if you compare this whole idea, so at the moment, OpenAI basically democratized the debate around AI and kind of brought AI ethics much more to the fore than it was before in the bubbles. Would you say that Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos kind of democratized the debate around space and also like going up to space? Because I can remember that when Jeff Bezos shot his first satellites up into space, I was like, oh yeah, so this is being democratized and it's getting normal to kind of shoot things into space. And I don't know, would you say that there's a parallel here? And what does that parallel mean? Also kind of looking towards the open source AI ethics debate kind of.
Yeah, well, let me address your last piece first about open source. I know for a lot of people, open source automatically sounds like a good thing. I mean, it is to some extent, but it depends on what we're talking about, right? So you don't want to open source your nuclear weapons. You don't want to open source biological pathogens that could be manufactured, right? You don't want to give out blueprints for that. So it depends on what we're talking about. We're talking about outer space. I think it's a dual use, is a double-edged sword. On one hand, there's a benefit for more people to be involved in outer space, educators, students, climate scientists, climate activists. On the other hand, that means there's more people, more stuff in outer space that's contributing, fueling the space debris problem. And to the extent that it's also concentrating more power in the hands of private individuals and companies, that could be problematic. If you think about the early days of the Russian, war against Ukraine, Starlink was involved. Starlink was providing internet access to Ukraine, and it had threatened to cut off that service. I mean, it actually did in one incident. But imagine that. Foreign policy can be created by one private individual, right? If Elon Musk had decided to turn off his internet access to Ukraine, which would seriously have, hampered their intelligence and surveillance efforts, that could have turned the tide in that war. One private individual. Do we really want that? That sounds dangerous. I mean, if that one person was, Plato's definition of an aristocrat, someone who's educated and excellent, okay. But, for lesser private individuals, that sounds dangerous.
Yeah, it might even be for the Plato philosopher kings. So they have not always done that much good, I would say, even though. So thank you very much again. And I take this as the final word. Space is the future. It will still be sometimes till we see the ships burning at the shoulder of Orion, although they also probably create a lot of debris. Thank you very much, Patrick.
Thank you.
And many thanks also to every one of you for joining us, contributing to the discussions. And many thanks to the TUM think tank for their hospitality. This was our last speaker series for this year, but stay tuned for exciting talks in 2024. Thank you and have a good holiday season and a good new year.